Thanks, Peter. All right, well, thank you for having me here.
See?
And I never lecture with microphones, even with 300, 400 students. They can usually hear me. It's very nice to be here. The talk that I want to give is, I want to say a few things about the kind of the setup. It is not the way I usually approach these things. As a professor, when I go to my students, I will outline multiple explanations of things, then we look at possible, how to interpret things, how to look at history, what the evidence is, all sorts of nice things. I don't have the time to do this, obviously, because it'll take a semester to do this. So what I will do is I will give you my perspective on what's going on. And when it says here UCSD, that's my perspective. I'm not speaking on behalf of the university, anything like this. I have been following the war, obviously, actually since it started, and I'll explain why I think it started way before February of this year. So I'm very happy to tell you about the evidence I have, why I interpret certain things the way I do. I do not have access to classified information, so it's all open source. I do read Ukrainian and Russian and all this stuff, so I read both sides here and I try to piece together what seem like reasonable interpretations. I do have access to sources that purport to be, have insider information. I don't believe most of them do actually, but, it is as it is. So, without further ado, I want to talk to you a little bit about the setup. So today actually was a very stressful day for me. A lot of stuff was happening. I spent it in front of the computer, lots of developments. I'll get to this at the end. But before we get to the end, we need to start somewhere. And the way we usually approach explaining wars is we try to look for two sets of causes. So I would call long-term causes. So these are processes, historic processes that unfold over many years and essentially create a situation of conflict of interest that then somehow has to be resolved. And then the immediate causes, which is the next slide, is essentially why can't they resolve the problem that they have without fighting? Fighting is very risky, it's very dangerous, it's very costly, it costs a lot of human life and misery, and it's not a good way to resolve conflict. So why do they do this? So that's the short-term cause. And today I'm going to give you a bit of both. And here I will give you what I think are the kind of the three perspectives. Now, of course, the Russian and the Ukrainian would be the most important ones, but we are also interested how does this affect us? Like, what have we done to either contribute to this or try to solve the problem, and why have we ended up where we have? All right, so first, of course, is the Russian view. And there's three very important things to bear in mind here. First, there's a range of opinion what the Russians are doing. Nobody can read Putin's mind. Nobody knows what the heck is going on, really. So I will give you kind of an increasing order of probability what's going on. The view that is, the Russians themselves have mentioned a couple of times, and is very popular in some circles in the West, that this is a security-driven problem. And the story goes like this. Ukraine, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and Russia lost essentially a protective buffer of territories. That's why I have this map here. And the logic is very simple. If you look at the map, you can see that essentially if you want to go to Russia from the West, you have a very narrow corridor here in Poland. It's actually several hundred miles between the Baltics and the mountains. And then it opens up into this great plain where it's incredibly difficult to defend. And so the story is very simple. All invasions from the West have happened through this corridor here, from the Pripyat marshes through Poland. And so whether you're a Russian emperor, whether you're a Communist Party leader, or whether you're Putin and whatever that regime is, you always have one concern in mind, and this is ensuring that you push your kind of border, so to speak, as far here toward Poland as you can. Right? That's the story. And that actually has been very popular. And then, of course, the story goes, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they lost the Baltics, they lost Poland, control over the government in Poland, they lost Belarus, they lost Ukraine, and suddenly they are very exposed. So they feel very vulnerable. And in addition, some people believe that the expansion of NATO, including many of these countries as part of the alliance, has heightened the sense of vulnerability for the Russians. Now, I mentioned this because it is a very popular story. Putin has mentioned it a few times. It's come in our press many times. Some of my colleagues at various places promote this. I don't believe it's true. I actually happen to think it's just a fig leaf, basically an excuse. And very quickly, the reason for this, it makes sense on the map when you look at it, but it doesn't make sense in the 21st century because the question then always will be, okay, what are you going to do if you go this way? What exactly is it in for the West to conquer there? Since the end of the Cold War, the West has been buying everything it's needed from Russia. It's not like they have a great market to access. They only have raw materials. It's basically gas, oil, there's special other raw materials that are very important, but they've been selling them to us, right? So what are we going to do? Go and conquer these parts here and then administer them ourselves? It makes absolutely no sense. So what is this threat? And this is not just my opinion. On the eve of the war, and that's a key piece kind of I want to mention, on the eve of the war, the Russian military officers, retired of course, because active officers cannot express disapproval of government policy, retired officers, they published an open letter to Putin. You can still find it on the club of the All Russian Officers Association. The president wrote a letter saying, this is all nonsense. NATO is a competitor. Yes, we have to deal with them, but it is not a threat. All this stuff about this is absolute nonsense. We should not fight this war, because he went on to predict exactly what happened, essentially. Which is a very good analysis. So this is from a guy who's considered an imperialist, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. So this view is popular. And of course, the kernel of this view is like, we contributed to this war because with the NATO expansion. But of course, the NATO expansion happened because all of these countries here are very afraid of the Russians. Very, very afraid. Because the problem if you're Russian, right, and if you want to have your protective buffer, is that you cannot have these countries remain independent. That's always been the problem. Why? Because again, you have very little to offer in terms of trade, in terms of technology, in terms of know-how. Everybody starts reorienting very quickly to the West. That's what necessitated the conquest of Poland and the partitioning before. That is what necessitated turning these countries into communist regimes, because you cannot trust these governments to remain neutral and act as buffers. So, yes, if you're in the US looking across the pond, you draw the lines here, well, they have the sphere of influence, let's give it to them. But as somebody who lived in that sphere of influence right here, we're not very happy about this. And everybody who's lived, the closer you are to Russia, the less happy you are about this sphere of influence, essentially, in general, right? So keep this in mind. Now, what I think is going on is this second part. And you have to understand, the war we're seeing today began with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because the Russian elites never reconciled themselves with the loss of Ukraine. Never. So even today, when people say, well, if Putin is removed and if the regime falls, what do you think is going to replace him? He is actually moderate in that range of opinion among the Russian elites in the Kremlin, right? The range of opinion there, as far as I can tell from their writings, consistently since 1991, the stuff they've said and done, ranges from we need to ensure indirect control of Ukraine, so the way they had tried to do until 2014, when it failed, and I'll give you a reason for that. The way they're doing in Belarus, for instance, still, right? We have this indirect control. So they're kind of nominal independent, but for the stuff we care about, they listen to us. And then it ranges through all the way to, this is really not even a country that's part of Russia. It always has been, we'll have to take it. So that's the extreme imperialist view. That extreme imperialist view is not even clear where it ends here, what else they consider part of Russia. It's certainly the Baltic, some of them, certainly parts of Poland would fall into this, and so on and so forth. So that's the range of opinion. So when you take Putin, he was, until maybe very recently, somewhere in the middle of this, ironically speaking. So when you want his demise, be aware that what replaces him might be worse than him. I don't think it's very likely, actually, but we'll get to this in 10 minutes or so. And finally, there's the internal legitimation. Putin came to power basically in the middle of the most terrible crisis the Russians had experienced basically forever. I mean, no matter how bad the Soviet Union was, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things were very bad. And he did certain things that, for a while, the economy started booming, people started, foreign investment started flowing in, and he became very popular with this. But the problem is these kind of reforms, because the regime he constructed does not actually allow for economic development. It's essentially a kleptocratic state where a few oligarchic elites, clans, control everything. It doesn't allow for further development. These started to slow down. And they started to slow down after the 2010s. And then things got very bad. The social indicators in Russia, they started going bad. The life expectancy, healthcare, all this stuff, pensions. And people started noticing this, right? And what happened after the conquest of Crimea, the bloodless, so to speak, conquest of Crimea, his ratings shot back up a lot. So now essentially what you have is, first of all, an example that if you do this thing that looks like we're putting Russia back on the map, they've ignored us for long enough, we're back to our place in the sun, a lot of Russians respond positively to this. They do see, a lot of them, the fall of the Soviet Union as a loss of a huge empire, prestige, right? We've been ignored for too long. We're going to get off our knees, as he puts it. So this, helped improve, shore up his legitimacy at home, right? And then Ukraine itself, as I'll explain shortly why this is the 2022 is this basically window of opportunity to attack it, started sliding out of this control that he has been trying to exert since the fall of the Soviet Union. And the problem is, if you have a successful westernizing country right next on the border, and that country is Ukraine, which wants membership in the European Union, which it may have gotten in 30, 40 years, now it will get it much sooner, membership in NATO, which it probably would never have gotten, and now it probably will, at this point it looks very bad. It's moving forward, you're losing control, and there's a chance to actually arrest this development and solidify your position at home. So internal legitimation, I think, also played a role in this. So this, of course, sets it up as the Russian side. What about the Ukrainian side? You need to understand, Ukraine, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did not suddenly become a budding democracy with the rule of law or anything like this. It was just as corrupt as Russia. They had their own oligarchs. They're slightly smaller, because of course there's less to steal here than here. But it was just as bad. And their elites split into two, roughly speaking, groups. One of them, one big group with a lot of income, they were dependent on resources that were provided by Russia, cheap gas and things like this, right? And the Russians could control them by controlling essentially access to gas. They had several crises where the Russians would kind of reduce the supply and have all these kind of things when they got out of line. But these elites profited a lot from a close relationship with Russia. However, you did have the new elites that profited from an enhanced relationship with the West. And so you have these two groups essentially in Ukraine struggling for a while to see who's going to prevail. And for a while, all Ukrainian governments essentially conducted what is euphemistically called the multi-vector policy. They basically just tried to sit on two chairs at the same time. They tried to play nice with Russia, they tried to play nice with the West. They varied, of course, in the extent, so when you say pro-Western, Yushchenko, pro-Russian, Yanukovych, you have to be careful what these labels really mean. They're not as extreme as the labels might suggest, right? They're much actually closer. They all tried this. And twice, the Ukrainian people kind of corrected some of the course, right? And these are the so-called revolutions that happened. And the latest one in Maidan in 2014 that happened in the square, in Maidan Square in Kyiv, is what triggered the annexation of Crimea. So here, from the Ukrainian perspective, they have security problems as well. That's why you have to play nice with Russia. I mean, it's a big neighbor to have with what we thought was the second military in the world. So it's a dangerous opponent. The Ukrainians at the end of the Cold War had nuclear weapons. And they also had at least half of the Black Sea Soviet fleet, right? So they spent a lot of time discussing who's going to get what and what's going to happen. And this is where we actually intervened. And it compelled, essentially twisted the Ukrainians' arms to give up their nuclear weapons. We were very concerned to essentially pull all the nukes into one place so we can count them and control them, make sure no unsavory characters get them, right? And so we basically told the Ukrainians, if you want help from us for economic development and things like this, you got to give up the nukes, and we'll guarantee your security. And sure we did. We signed a piece of paper with the Russians. We guaranteed their security and territorial integrity. They gave up the nukes. They gave up essentially most of the Black Sea fleet. They leased the Sevastopol for a Russian base. And as far as we're concerned, that's done. We basically had no further interest in Ukraine. So this idea that we somehow have been supporting Ukraine for a long time is absolute nonsense. We basically didn't care about them. We kind of wanted this problem to just go away somehow. Okay, the economic development, as I said, do you go with Russia? Some elites pulling this way, some elites pulling the other way, and the internal legitimation. And this is where the Ukrainian government eventually ran into problems. Because in 2013, the Russians said, Putin said, it's time to declare yourself. Which way are you going to go? I'm offering a customs union with you. You're going to integrate your economy with Russia, and we're going to provide security and all this stuff. And at the same time, the European Union said, if you want anything done, don't do that, because that will be the end of the association. He actually bargained with both of them. Who's going to bid for more help to give to Ukraine? The European Union said, no, we're done with the bribes, just decide. Putin said, here's a few billion to do all sorts of stuff. The Ukrainians were desperately needing money. They had serious financial problems. And so he withdrew Ukraine from the association agreement. And that triggered the protests. Protests were initially small. People thought, oh my God, he's going to go the same way as Lukashenko in Belarus is going. He's going to become a dictator. It's a problem. They showed up. Initially, not a whole lot of support for this. But then the government made a mistake, which hopefully is the same mistake the Iranian government is doing right now. They tried to use force to suppress these demonstrators. And that turned out more people in the street, and then people died. Over 100 people were killed. And this eventually scared Yanukovych, who fled suddenly to Russia. And then in this chaos, Putin moved in to seize Crimea. And in fact, he moved in to seize several other things. It's just Crimea is the only one that worked. There are several forces. They moved in to seize government buildings on the Crimea scenario in Kharkiv. They did this in Donbass, of course, in Luhansk and Donetsk. They did this in Zaporozhye. They did this in Odessa. In all other places except Donbass, they were chased out. So it only lasted a couple of days. The Ukrainians reasserted control, but that did not work for the other areas. And so this is kind of the setup. Long-term causes, you have these countries struggling for this. They have all these concerns. How are we going to solve this? Is this country now going to go pro-Western or not? And so now we get to the immediate causes. And this, I think, is what explains why the war started in February of this year. I wrote a piece right when the Crimean started happening, where I wrote this scenario, the way things are going, it ends only in one way. And it's going to be an invasion by Russia of Ukraine and a partitioning of Ukraine of some sort, because I thought at the time we're just not going to lift a finger to help them, right? And so I've then had some prescriptions what to do. So the road to war was clear 8 years ago. It was coming no matter what. Basically, there was just no way to avoid it, I think. But you still need to explain the timing. And the timing is that the annexation of Crimea, which had been planned before, obviously, it was an act of desperation at the time. Because when you see that the Kiev regime, basically you're losing, your preferred candidate has just been chased out of town for the exact reasons that he's being replaced by government, is going to do exactly what you don't want them to do, it looks like you're losing control, indirect control, that you've been banking on for all these years. Then, in order to fix this, this is where the war in Donbass, the two republics, was unleashed, which is mostly fought initially. There was some locals involved, but the locals, when the Ukrainians launched their what they call the anti-terrorist operations, they very quickly actually dealt with these. So that necessitated the Russians sending regular troops, which defeated twice the Ukrainian military, which was very weak at the time. And in fact, a lot of them, not a lot, but there were cases where entire units would defect to the Russians. There was a lot of infiltration of Russian interest in the Ukrainian military and the security services, so it's a complete mess. But essentially, Putin did not fight this to win. The goal in the war in Donbass was never to actually win it, is to keep an open wound, drag the Kiev regime down, and eventually force a change in course. He did not need these things to go independent and resolve the conflict, because then you lose the pressure on the regime. But the problem is, the Ukrainians essentially settled the war in Donbass. They didn't like the outcome, but over the last 3 years, 2.5 years of this fighting, there was actually essentially almost no fighting. It simply froze. There were on average fewer than 20 civilian casualties per year in this war over the last 3 years. So the pressure simply wasn't working. The Ukrainians were talking about getting it back, but it was clear that they're not going to do anything, because you're not going to attack Russian forces, Russian-backed forces. And essentially it was dying down. So the pressure point was no longer working. So this failure of Putin's destabilizing strategy, I think, is a very important factor. Then Ukraine continued the integration with the West. You know, Zelensky initially was elected. He's actually from the East. He's Russian-speaking originally. He's meant to be building these bridges. He was very popular when he was elected. Turned out to be a terrible president. He said, couldn't achieve a whole lot, corruption charges. On the eve of the war, his popularity was, I think, less than 30%. So looks like a weak government. It's about to fall anyway. So the country's moving in the wrong direction. I'm losing control of the process. The government seems to be weak. Then have my spies, as we keep finding out how many spies and actually informants they have had in all the Ukrainian military, the security, which they're still weeding out in the administration. So it looks like, and they actually run surveys. You could get access to the FSB surveys about, they actually asked Ukrainians point blank, if Russians came tomorrow, would you treat them as liberators or as occupiers? I mean, they would actually run surveys like this. I don't know why they didn't use the results, because the results said, we'll treat them as occupiers. But what they latched on is one key response in one of these surveys, which was, are you going to fight against them? And only about 40% said yes, absolutely, and about 30% were kind of undecided. And they said, nobody will actually resist us. That's great. So if we set this up, we come in, there will be no resistance. And finally, weaknesses of the European Union, NATO, and the US. The European Union is going through a very painful Brexit, essentially divorce. There's the rise of nationalist parties in Hungary, Italy is shaky. France, nobody knows what's going on in France. NATO, what purpose does NATO have? President Trump went and kind of, essentially shook that institution to its core, so to speak. So the US seems to have lost its leadership there as well. And in the US, host of problems, economic, political, domestic, you name it. They'll be distracted. It's the perfect time to launch this. I mean, not perfect. You're kind of forced to do it because you're losing. But if you're going to do it now, now is the time. Because if these things start to change, as they eventually will, you're going to be in a weaker and weaker position. Question is, could the US have prevented this war? I often get asked this, and the answer is a clear and unequivocal no, absolutely not. Why do I know this? Because we tried, and we couldn't. We got hold of their plans early on. I don't know how, but we basically had the entire plan, where they're going to attack, with what forces, not at the exact time, but we nailed the date pretty close, actually. We went to the Russians and said, don't do this, we know what you're doing. Literally, we told them this. Here are the plans, we have them, don't do this. And the Russians said, no, we're not doing this, we will never invade. Okay, so we went to our European allies. The Russians will attack. You said this about Iraq too, forget it. Our indications are different. Of course, they don't have our intelligence capabilities. Give us the evidence. Well, we can't give you the evidence because that means telling you how we got it. Can't give it, trust us. No, we can't trust you. Big problem. And in the Ukrainian society, there's also this. In the government, there was kind of a split. Some people believed it and pushed the government to do certain things. And in fact, the Ukrainians did do certain things, as we found out later. They saved the Air Force. They dispersed the Air Force, for instance, which is why it wasn't destroyed by the Russians. And now you see a lot of Ukrainians using planes that, according to the Russians, they destroyed the Air Force at least 3 times, if I believe, in the first month. But they dispersed them and hit them because some commanders actually did believe this. But as a whole, the government just did not want, because again, if you expect an invasion, what you would expect is an invasion here in the eastern Ukraine to take the territories that you're claiming to care about, not what the Russians actually unleashed. So that was a big problem. And so we tried, and there was simply, nobody believed us. Now our situation, our credibility has been slightly restored. All right, so what's happening? What was Putin's plan to conquer, how was he going to conquer Ukraine? Now, I'm going to tell you plan A, plan B. I have no idea whether they have plan A or plan B. This is just my names that labels very clear breaks in how the war was fought and how the plan seems to have changed. So bear with me. The first phase, which lasted less than a month, right? It was very clear. It was going to be a lightning war, a blitzkrieg, that is the Russians are going to attack essentially from all directions. They're going to attack from the occupied Crimea. They're going to attack from Russia. They're going to attack from Belarus. And what they're going to do is they're going to try to cut off essentially the east bank of the Dnepr River and encircle the Ukrainian forces here if they can. And simultaneously, they're going to wage these, very Hollywood-like assaults on Kiev with paratroopers and things like this to penetrate the capital and topple the government. And the expectation was the government will either flee or they'll be able to assassinate him, and then they'll just install another guy. He's going to call for peace, 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 and then we partition the country. We're going to take this part, and then some rump things kind of remains over there. That seems to have been the plan. And that is what they tried. They, very clear, given the attacks and what they tried to occupy, the goal was to expand here, the possessions in the south, to essentially cut off Ukraine from both the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. So, and provide, first of all, land corridor to Crimea, so they can access Crimea not through this bridge here that the Ukrainians may actually destroy at some point, but actually by land. Provide water access to Crimea. Crimea essentially is a desert, and there's a canal here that the Ukrainians built back in Soviet times to supply it with water and turn the economy around, which they did. But when the Russians took Crimea, the Ukrainians stopped the water supply. So there's an ecological disaster basically here in Crimea. So they had to open this, which means control this part here. Take Odessa, huge port, and essentially box in Ukraine, because whatever remains here then, it doesn't matter how much it wants to go to the west, it will have to deal with Russia because it basically has no access to anything, right? A lot of the resources that Ukrainians have, gas and oil, they're either in the zone here of Crimea in the Black Sea or here in the Donbass area. There's some in the Carpathians, but essentially that's the idea. So basically the idea is we're going to topple the government, it's going to make peace, and we're going to go away with 5 provinces. We're going to take the Kharkiv oblast, the region of Kharkiv. We're going to Kharkiv here. We're going to take Luhansk. We're going to take Donetsk. We're going to take Zaporozhye, Kherson, right? So all of this part. And that's how they found out, and these are the areas they tried to occupy. The only part of this operation that went really, really well was here in the south. When they very quickly went, they surrounded Mariupol very quickly. They pushed on, they failed to take Zaporozhye, which turned out to be a huge problem right now, as we find out. But they did take Kherson, and they crossed the Dnipro River, and they started pushing toward Mykolaiv to take Odessa. This area, you need to understand, it fell very quickly, and it did not fall through fighting. It fell because of treason, and local collaborators simply pointed the way and did not organize a defense. So we're learning more and more about this part. This failed miserably, right? So they stopped and they tried different things, but it just didn't work. So that was the strategy. Blitzkrieg, that's what we're going to do. It's going to take a couple of weeks, and then all good, we're done. It's all going to work. It's the Chechen scenario, basically, if we can swing it. What did we do in response when this started? First of all, massive sanctions that were not implemented immediately. When I say massive, this is what they're going to be at some point. You have to understand, the most important sanctions actually is going to be coming into effect only at the end of this year and early next year. We actually haven't started squeezing really hard yet, for obvious reasons. Squeezing them out is very painful for us in the West as well. So it has to be done gradually, and hopefully they will respond before we start to have to squeeze very hard. Like if you go and immediately hit them with the hardest weapon you get, you have nothing left to bargain with. Right now you have. Please stop, or we'll do more. And we have a lot more actually to do. International effort to isolate Russia would turn out to be incredibly successful, and something that people did not really expect, capital flight from Russia on a massive scale, which was not coordinated by anybody, who's actually hurting more than the sanctions right now, right? And then we started limited help to the Ukrainians. We, and I say me too, we expected that they will have to fight a guerrilla warfare, the Afghanistan type. The Russians will take Kiev, encircle the cities at the very least, pound them into submission, destroy them, and the Ukrainians will basically, so we have to send them weapons suitable for this. Now, after the first week, I wrote my first blog saying, what if Kiev doesn't fall? Like, this was crazy at the time, but saying it's possible. So we need to send them different kind of weapons. And then a week later I said, what if the Russian Federation falls apart as a result of the war? People thought I was completely bonkers out of my mind, but it looks increasingly possible that that's actually what's going to happen in the end. So anyway, our limited military help was limited for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the type of weapons we wanted to send could not be, first of all, no advanced weapons, because if the Russians get hold of them, they're going to reverse engineer them, if they have any engineers left at this point, but they could try it, so we don't want to do this. And then, it was not exactly clear what goal we were supporting in Ukraine. Ukrainian victory, kind of, we're going to be happy if Ukraine kind of just survived in some form or another. It wasn't very clear. The voices from the administration were a bit confusing. And immediately we ruled out direct intervention, which was actually, I think, a brilliant move. Many people were calling for direct intervention. I thought at the time it would be a terrible idea. The Russians just, for reasons I'll explain, it's a little weird, but they do want a military intervention from the West so they can settle the war with us rather than with the Ukrainians, because they think we can manipulate the Ukrainians enough. What was Russia's response to all of this? First of all, they thought their sanctions would be limited the way they were after Crimea. They're going to be ineffective. The West is not going to hold, basically. It's exactly as it happened in the past. Western unity was a big question. It still is in some parts of the West, because there's a lot of Russian influence in Western Europe. Lots of Russian money, lots of Russian influence. I mean, the Germans had to nationalize the Russian subsidiaries, the gas companies, to figure out if they have 10% of politicians that are not in Putin's pay or something. I'm exaggerating, but it's very bad. So you had all these voices calling, oh, let's de-escalate, let's stop, you're just prolonging the war, So this is a factor. Many countries would jump at the opportunity to help Russia circumvent the sanctions. The Russians have a lot of stuff to sell, the thinking went. Especially they counted on China and India here, and that did not pan out, as we shall see. And finally, the European dependence on energy sources from Russia is going to eventually carry the day anyway, because they simply cannot afford to live without this. So we're going to outlast them. That's the idea. And so here's the gains in the south and east. These are the big conquests, as I said. This is where they got to Kherson and tried to advance toward Mykolaiv to take Odessa. This is here when they encircled, destroyed essentially Mariupol, and eventually captured it. So they eventually captured this entire area here in the south and the east. And in the north, this is their first kind of attack on Kiev, which was supposed to be hit from 3 sides, but they essentially were defeated there, and they had to withdraw. Now, they called this a gesture of goodwill. Yeah. More of these if we can. So what happened here? Why this ended up this way? The outcome of this was actually failure despite conquering about 20% of the country. And the biggest failure is the regime in Kiev didn't fall. That was the linchpin of this entire strategy, is they wanted Kiev to fall, but it didn't. And number two, the population, contrary to the FSB surveys that they misinterpreted, did not rally, did not go to meet the invaders with open arms, right? Not en masse. Early in the war, in the desperate first weeks of the war, when the government basically instituted an open policy, anybody who wants to fight, here's the weapon, go and fight. I mean, these are not very useful soldiers. They're kind of okay maybe for defense here and there and support, but not great militarily. And when they did this, and I watched the videos when they were lining up to get the weapons from the various villages, and they were voting in the villages, should we surrender, should we resist, what should we do? When you saw, I wrote a Facebook post at the time, do you know how you know Ukraine will win this? When the government gave weapons to everybody who wanted to have weapons, they did not go to Kiev. They went to fight the Russians. And that's how you know the win is, because now the Russians essentially are fighting the entire nations. Now, nation is still, I will explain, it's a changing concept what's happening in Ukraine. The fact that the US was able to coordinate a response was astounding to me, personally. I thought our influence had been damaged irreparably, or at least would take years to recover. And that is why when 2014, I thought we would abandon the Ukrainians just like we have abandoned basically everybody else during the Cold War. We abandoned the, Germany, not Berlin, West Berlin we kept. But we abandoned Germany, we abandoned Hungary, abandoned is a strong word. We did not go to help. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, even Poland, never did anything. Recently, the Kurds, does anybody talk about them? Our allies. We abandoned them as well. So we kind of have a history of, when it comes to a big conflict with maybe Russia, of pulling back and trying to find a peace that kind of abandons people. So I thought we'd just throw the Ukrainians under the bus. So I was surprised when we didn't do this. I bet the Russians were very surprised as well at this. The nearly universal condemnation was also sort of a surprise. Again, there's many countries in the world that, surprise, surprise, do not see through the world through our lens. They're not exactly, they may not be our enemies, they're not exactly our friends. And there was a chatter for a decade already that we need another counterpoint. That, China, Russia, they're creating a new kind of regime, financial, economic, trade, to counter this dominance of the West. And it seemed there's some interest in this. Turns out, not really. Why? Because the West retains an absolutely dominant economic and financial position in the world. And so when push came to shove, friends of Russia disappeared. They just melted. You have Eritrea, you have Belarus, you have North Korea, and basically that's it. China and India suddenly started to basically not say much, speak, we're against conflict in general, blah, 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 and not helping the Russians the way many people thought they would. They did ramp up imports from Russia, absolutely. They're going to strip Russia basically as much as they can, especially China. We'll get to this part later. They're using this war and they benefited tremendously from it, don't get me wrong, but they're not helping the Russians circumvent the sanctions. They're not sending weapons or anything like this. Why? Because they're afraid of Western secondary sanctions. Their trade relationship with us is just too important. Russia has the economy the size of Belgium. It's just not a thing. That's it, compared to us. And so this was part of the reason this whole thing kind of started to fall to pieces. These reasons that I mentioned here, some of them were simply unpredictable. Who would have known that Zelensky is going to stay and fight? Well, he probably knew, but for us, nobody. Until push comes to shove and the person, metal is shown in action, you don't know this. If he had fled, it would have been very difficult to organize a resistance. They still would have fought, but it would have been much, much harder. That Biden would be that effective, I certainly didn't think he would be. And the West would actually unify for once on something, that's amazing. Now, difficult to predict, but very uncertain. China's reaction could have gone either way, as most people say, there's a lot of reasons in China to kind of try to dethrone Western influence. So they do have some reasons, but it turned out eventually the fear of what this might mean for the economy seems to have, at least for now, kept it in check. The part predictable but misread, I said these studies of Ukrainian society. This was predictable, but the Russian side simply misunderstood what was going on. And then the hidden part. And the biggest ally to the Ukrainians, probably bigger than the United States, is the corruption in the Russian military. Because it turned the second army in the world is just that on paper. They have a lot of problems. 20 years, they've basically stolen half of the stuff there. It's just nothing. There's the battalions are actually not fully formed. The tanks, half of them run but don't shoot. The others shoot but don't run. It's a big problem, right? And this The fact that you promoted a bunch of people for their loyalties and to reward them means the planning was not that great. They do have very smart people, obviously, in the general staff and here and there, but the key people making decisions are loyalists to Putin, and they're not exactly selected for their smarts. I just put it this way. So what is the result of all of this? You're in Moscow. Okay, my plan didn't work. Well, if you know Putin, you know exactly what he's going to do, which is he's going to double down. He's not going to retreat after this. The one thing that they seem to have abandoned, for now at least, is the regime change idea. Now we're going to force Zelensky's regime to negotiate with us. We still want the territories, that's for sure. That's why they're going to run referenda and stuff like this now there. That has been unchanged. What's the strategy? The strategy is brutal. It is now no longer lightning attacks, we save the infrastructure because we're going to take the territory. No. We're going to grind the Ukrainians essentially using war of attrition, which you don't need smart weapons for this. You just need a lot of artillery. And they had, and still have, plenty of it, plenty. In fact, it's vast, the superiority, just unbelievable. This is why they kept advancing for 7 months. They're going to break down civilian morale, they thought, right? By attacking cities, causing civilian casualties. And they're going to start conducting this policy of de-Ukrainization, Russification, essentially. Because if they didn't meet us with flowers, there's something wrong with them. They're completely deluded, so we have to re-educate them. They actually published a plan in RIA, in one of the major outlets. There's a publication of this plan. It kind of came out when they thought they were winning, so you can read it and marvel at it. But essentially, it's a policy that inevitably must lead to genocidal strategies. It has to. They will have to find members of the administration, of the regime, members of the military, the security, the police, everybody who's ever thought bad thoughts about Russians, and get rid of them. And then re-educate the rest, especially the children, right? So in this strategy immediately is going to be built in Bucha and Izium and all the stuff that we're going to be learning more and more about. It's inevitable. Okay. In this, Putin wants to keep the war as far away from the Russian people as possible. It's abstract. For most Russians, you see it in the news. Oh, they support the war, 80% support the war. It's because it doesn't affect them. There's no emergency. Until maybe in a few days this might start changing in certain regions there. But essentially, Russia has been fighting this on a peacetime footing. Peacetime legislation, there's no martial law, there's no mobilization, there's nothing like this. It's fought, and I will explain the structure of the Russian army, because it's not what you think it is, which explains why it's losing so badly right now. But he's trying, that's basically, domestically, that's a special military operation. And it's not that he doesn't want to call it a war. Calling it a war has legal repercussions. Different laws get activated. Special military operation, something happens there, people under contract go and fight, volunteers, mercenaries, which they're not called mercenaries, but they're mercenaries. And we don't care about this, right? So for most Russians, the war has become, they've seen the prices rise, but nothing much. Yes, we lost access to the malls, which may actually eventually piss them off enough. But for most of them, it's an abstract thing. And this might actually be changing. So that's part of the idea. What did we do? Well, we now realized, okay, the regime's not going to fall. Let's give them more arms that they can actually start defending properly. So we start escalating the provision of arms, giving them systems now that they're actually useful for things, not just guerrilla warfare. We started economic and financial aid, and we started providing a lot of intelligence sharing, which has allowed the Ukrainians to coordinate very, very well and do a lot with very limited resources. And make no mistake, they did have extremely limited resources. To this day, they're entirely dependent on us. The Ukrainians in the first days of the war, they ran out of shells, they ran out of bullets essentially in several of the locations. They did not have much. And they're still reliant on us. So yes, they have the people they want to fight, but without a supply from us, they're not going to last very long. So that's why we've basically escalated this. What would the Russians now do to this? What was their response to all of this? They tried import substitution. So basically, Russian representatives from companies and everything, industries, they spread around the world looking for ways to circumvent the sanctions, find alternative supply, blah, 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 all this stuff. Local know-how, how to rig things so they work without the Western chips and the Western tech. And this is failing very miserably. One thing that worked in their favor for the first several months, however, is the prices of oil and gas shot through the roof. Everybody in Europe, the governments panicked and started buying to replenish their gas reserves and all this stuff. So as a result, money just started pouring into the Kremlin's coffers from the West. And he used this to tide over the population and prevented the worst meltdown that people expected. So it didn't happen. So of course, they then trumpeted this, oh, look, our economy is so resilient. That's a very limited resource, and it's about to end, basically. But this prolonged the war, obviously, by months. So they tried to do this. They, of course, will tighten the media control, increase repression, and activated a bunch of useful idiots. That's Lenin's term. Useful idiots in the West. These are people who sympathize with their causes without actually living there. And then their work contributes to the success of these causes. So the communists love these people. Putin also has a bunch of these. Okay, assessment. Partial success in this phase, which I think ended essentially in August. Why partial success? They were gaining more land. It was very slow tempo, grinding. The Ukrainians were fighting, but they were retreating. They were retreating everywhere. Slowly, inch by inch, but they were retreating. And the Russians essentially managed to capture all of Luhansk. They advanced a little bit in Donetsk as well. However, to offset these gains, you had suddenly things that looked very ominous to the Russians. NATO enlargement. Just adding Finland, tripled, I think, the border of NATO with Russia. Now, if you believe that NATO is a threat, that should really, really make you afraid. But as I told you, the NATO threat is just blah, blah, blah. What was their reaction to this? We don't care about NATO, then it's okay. In fact, they withdrew forces from the Finland border. Why? Because the safest place, I think, to have a border with is a NATO country. So they're not going to attack you. And they know it, right? So they withdrew, actually. They denuded the border with Finland to throw stuff into Ukraine. So this whole NATO thing was just a bluff. The EU, of course, offered candidacy status to Ukraine, accelerated, and to Moldova. In Black Sea, they had a bunch of embarrassments, including losing their flagship to a country that doesn't even have a war fleet. That's a bit of a problem. And then Turkey, China, and even the Taliban that are actually illegal, the terrorist organization in Russia, but they showed up for talks and got a lot of concessions from the Russians because they were threatening to attack Tajikistan, and then it's a long story. But anyway, everybody started taking advantage of Putin. And essentially, Russia started to become a resource colony for China. And eventually, that's how it's going to end up being, most likely. All right, why did it end this way? First of all, and everybody knows this, Putin exercises a lot of political control over the military objectives. He micromanages this war. He thinks he's a brilliant strategist, maybe politically so, until recently. But militarily, not really. So there's a lot of problem. There's a lack of unified command, and I will tell you a little bit about how the Russian army is structured, because you will be floored when you learn that part. Then there was a purge of Russian agents in Ukraine. They started catching them. You can watch them. Every day there's new information about informants being fished out and stuff like this. So there's less and less intelligence. So the Russians don't know what the Ukrainians are up to. They can't track them. They can't figure it out. The effective, of course, resistance by the Ukrainian defense forces. I'm using here the abbreviation from the Ukrainian. But even despite all of this, whenever the Russians could achieve local superiority in artillery, they could advance. They would just pound everybody into submission, move over. Everything's burned out. There's nothing left, but they will take it. And no problems really on the domestic front for the reasons that I explained. So, results? In August, both sides had to take a breather. And everybody started predicting from mid-July on, there's going to be a big counteroffensive coming. Question is, who's going to launch it first? The first counteroffensive that the Ukrainians supposedly planned, the Russians took the initiative, and this was their plan B. And so nothing happened. And now there's a race again. Who's going to stockpile the weapons? Who's going to arrange the logistics and have a plan? And they thought it has to come in early September, essentially. And the analysts were right. It happened, right? And it turns out the Ukrainians went to go on the offensive first this time. Okay, so from early September until now, why do you need this counteroffensive? Well, first, of course, you need to liberate your land. That's an important aspect. But you need to shore up morale. It is very difficult to maintain your high morale and belief in victory when you're just losing but slowly. It just doesn't look good. So you need to show that somehow you can actually defeat the Russians by attacking them in open battle, so to speak. They also needed to shore up supporting the West to show we can win with the weapons you're giving us, so give us more. Right? We're not just going to sit there and do nothing. Liberating significant territories. There's still, in these parts here, there's about 1 million Ukrainians under Russian rule right now. Right? So they need to liberate these people as well. And of course, they need to consolidate that position for when the winter comes. And we'll talk a little bit about the winter. So what's the strategy? So the strategy was to concentrate forces both here in Kherson and here in the north around Izium, and keep the Russians guessing where they're going to attack. Right? For all of you who have seen The Princess Bride, there's a scene where the guy is talking to the Sicilian, where they're trying to outsmart each other in which cup the poison is. That is such a perfect metaphor for this. Just watch it. Because that's exactly right. So, they want to capture the south. This is their Kherson. They have to take it. That's what it's going to attack. But this is too obvious. Therefore, they're not going to attack there. They're going to attack in the north. But in the north, they don't have enough forces because they have been so concentrated here because they know that we know that they will probably not attack in the south. So they probably won't attack in the north and still attack. So they just tied themselves into knots. What happened is the Ukrainians attacked in both places in the end. However, they did it in very different ways. In the north, through intelligence, so you probably have read a little bit about how we helped them do this. The initial plan was to a massive attack in the south, to drive to Mariupol essentially and cut off the front here in two. And finally, they shared these plans with us, and our specialists looked and said, this is probably not going to work. It's very likely to fail, and it's going to cost you a lot of casualties. Don't do this. And the Ukrainians like, well, what do you suggest? Well, our intelligence says there's very weak spots here in this defense. Let's do this. And the Ukrainians went and planned it, and when they executed it, it surpassed all expectations. So they attacked, the main thrust was here, when they wedged real blitzkrieg, as I will explain in a second. And then here is a very different strategy, which actually is successful as well, but it's much, much slower. All right, so what's happening here? Here we gave them the advanced weaponry. Finally, we gave them systems with multiple launch missiles that they can target the smart weapons. It's one weapon, one target. You don't have to cover the area with 50 bombs and hope some of them hit something. And so they started destroying their depots with ammunition, with supplies. They're hitting command centers, sowing panic, and these were very effective. Of course, we did provide training and coordination as well. And finally, the administration seemed to have committed to essentially supporting Kiev to a military victory. It's very important because this means the Ukrainians now expect a continuous flow of supply from us so they can plan accordingly. One of the problems is that they don't know if help will come tomorrow. So today, they have to conserve what they have because they don't know if they're going to have enough tomorrow. If you know that the arsenal of democracy is on your side and is going to supply you, you can now plan offensive operations, which are much more expensive, actually, and very costly. Of course, we tightened more sanctions, especially for the winter season, and this is the most important thing, I think. Russian response, still looking for loopholes in the sanctions, despite not finding any. They went to buy weapons from Iran and North Korea, a country known for, one of the things they were known for, exporting weapons. They had the best weapons because NATO weapons sucked, that's what they said. And they're now in Iran, which is essentially selling them Chinese drones. And North Korea, which I actually don't even know what they're selling them, but Kim offered to send 200,000 North Korean troops to fight in Ukraine. Of course, he'll never do this because he puts them on the train, they're just going to run away. Who wants to live there? Anyway, so they tried hidden mobilization. So they started recruiting convicts for mercenaries. They started impressing people, forcibly taking people into the army in the areas they control in Donbass, LNR and DNR, the republics. They started escalating with nuclear accident threats around the Zaporizhia power plant, right? And trying to kind of break Western unity. This is kind of the strategy right now. So keep this conflict still as distant from the Russian people as possible for this stage as well. So the counteroffensive. Here is the area that the Ukrainians were able to liberate in the counteroffensive in the north. It's a vast area. It's essentially all of Kharkiv Oblast, which is why you're not hearing about referenda now being run in Kharkiv. They were planning them. They don't seem to have a place to run them now. They're still running them actually for Zaporozhye, despite not controlling the regional center, so that's interesting as well. And in the south, again, there was significant fighting, and there were significant gains as the Ukrainians started pressing, but it's very, very much slower. So why? Stunning tactical and political success for the Ukrainians. I'm not sure if it's a breaking point in the war yet, but it's definitely a very important phase in it. They liberated more than the Russians had taken in 5 months. They just liberated it in a week, essentially, right? Huge. Loss of these cities, Izium and Kupiansk here. This and Kupiansk is here on the Elskov River. Basically means that the entire northern operation for the Russians is threatened. This is very important transport arteries, so they may not be able to mount an effective defense of the Donbass. Russian morale in some of the units collapsed. Some of the units simply ran, and I'll again explain why. Commanders abandoned their soldiers. Soldiers didn't know what to do. Of course, when one unit panics and runs, the ones that they expose on the sides, they have to now retreat. If they go under fire, they have to abandon their equipment. And in the end, what happened is the high command essentially decided that the withdrawal into Russia and into Luhansk is probably the best bet to avoid massive losses. So unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they were not able to encircle the grouping in Izium, capturing a huge, several thousand Russian troops would have been a huge blow to the Kremlin, but they managed to get them out. And they took out most of their artillery as well, so that's also kind of unfortunate. The operation in Kherson is quite a bit slower because the terrain is very different. It's a flat area, there's a bunch of canals there, they so very favors defense, so essentially you have to have a creeping offense. You just conquer a bit of territory, move the artillery, conquer a little bit more, move it. You cannot do what they did here in the north, which was lightning strikes into the enemy rear and confusing them and things like this. So I'm kind of cautiously optimistic assessment. The Russians were outplayed by the surprise. They were surprised. And they were surprised despite, we have actually evidence, the local commanders in Izium were telling the chain command, we got nothing here. If these guys attack, we're toast. They will never attack there, was the response, and they just left them. The lack of unified command for the Russian army was key. One thing you have to understand is when I say Russian army, there's no such thing actually. It's 4 different military organizations fighting without unified command. We don't even know who directs this thing. Well, Putin in some sense, but a lot of these have their autonomous commanders, and some of these suspect each other, they don't like each other, they don't even help each other. So the regular army, Военные силы Российской Федерации, so these are the military, the Russian military. So these are the guys with the big guns, with the artillery, with the planes, right? They're right now mostly contract soldiers. These are all volunteers that have signed contracts to go and do something. And they have some draftees, but Putin repeatedly promised no draftees are fighting. He lied about this, but there are small numbers of draftees actually fighting. So contract soldiers, right? They are suffering right now from tremendous officer shortage. By some accounts, the Ukrainians have destroyed over 800 officers. It doesn't matter how many more soldiers you mobilize without officers to organize them, they're just target practice. So they have a big problem. These guys do not, as a rule, participate in many of the worst battles. They sit in the back, they shoot with the artillery, they send the planes, but Putin tries to essentially save as much of these as possible. The other force is the National Guard, Rosguardia, which part of it, for Chechnya's leaders Kadyrov, about 40,000 strong force, is part of this as well, nominally, but they're only responsive to Kadyrov, actually. It's a very interesting story why. But these guys, they're not actually soldiers. These are meant for suppression of internal unrest. So there's many of them, but they're completely useless in the field. So they were brought to kind of occupy towns, deal with local resistance, localized stuff, torture people, do this kind of stuff. So these are these guys. So they're essentially anti-riot forces. They're not useful for combat. The most effective force, in a sense, when it comes to punching through and things like this, have been the mercenaries. And you've heard the Wagner group, there's Redut, there's a bunch of others. And these are essentially people who just sign up to fight for pay, right? The problem is they've suffered massive casualties as well, so these are the ones now recruiting in the prisons, getting convicts out, promises of amnesty and stuff like this. And the fourth force is the mobilized troops from the republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, right? The Russians tend to actually very often despise them. They use them for cannon fodder. They don't supply them. There have been mutinies there. You can find numerous videos. They're refusing to serve. People from Luhansk do not want to fight in Donetsk and vice versa. Well, they're independent republics. You send me abroad. Why would you do this? Kind of stuff. So when they attack in the north, the Ukrainians attack positions manned by Rosguardia and mostly these guys. And they folded instantly, right? So they knew exactly, they had identified the position, so they managed to break through, and this in turn panicked some of the commanders here, and they started withdrawing. So that's what broke the front in the north. In the south, the situation is very different because a lot of these troops are the regular army, so there's a lot more resistance there. Then the Ukrainians fought with NATO-style tactics, local initiative by soldiers and commanders. They were all have very good communication, so they higher up the chain, they knew how to coordinate the units, but they would leave the locals to decide what to do. And so as a result, they will punch through, they will not stop to take a village or liberate a town, they would just bypass it and keep attacking. And it's exactly the strategy the Germans actually used in 1941 when they destroyed superior Soviet armies in front of them in a matter of weeks as well. They sowed confusion. If you read the Telegram channels and the intercepted communications, you can see the Russians like, the Ukrainians are attacking from everywhere. They're like 5 times our number. Oh my God, blah, blah, blah. They were not attacking from everywhere. The forces they committed in the north were basically equivalent to the forces the Russians had there. They didn't even have numeric superiority, but they were moving so fast that it looked like they were attacking from everywhere, cutting off, encircling you, so let's run before they encircle us. And just, these units, small and very mobile, moving through these forests, and the Russians couldn't find them. In fact, the Russians can't find 1,200 troops with their commanders. They still don't know. They're somewhere in Kharkiv. Nobody knows what the hell they are. Are they captured? Are they destroyed? Are they just wandering in small groups? Nobody knows. It's a big problem. So that's part of the reason this worked, right? So it's not like, again, you need to understand what you're fighting here. And when these changes that are happening today, how they're going to affect some of these calculations. So what now is the big question. Russia cannot regain ground in the north without endangering Kherson, for sure. The invincibility of the Russian army is now shattered, definitely, because now they tried to cover this up. Oh, it was an orderly withdrawal. Nobody bought it this time, like the gesture of goodwill. So they were no longer able to contain the bad news. So now if you listen to the Russian propagandists, which I have the misfortune of doing daily, the Ukrainians, we underestimated them. These are very tough. These are the strongest army in Europe after us. Suddenly. Kiev, in 3 days, we're fighting the strongest European army. So the blame game began. Who's guilty of this? What they're going to do? And then, very interestingly, here, the coming of winter actually favors the Ukrainian army, not the civilians, the army. It's very interesting because usually we think winter favors the Russians. That's historically not true because they froze in Finland. Well, the Finns were kind of skiing around them. But here, the Russians have no supplies. They were freezing already in March this year. They're definitely going to freeze now. They have no way to deal with the cold, while the Ukrainians have been supplied actually quite well, is my understanding. So the Russian situation is going to get really desperate. So now they've escalated into attacking hydroelectronic structures, dams on the Dnipro River. There's some very unpleasant consequences. They managed to do this. Question is whether they actually can is a different one. I don't think they're going to use nuclear weapons. Of course, now I probably have to say just unlikely, without exceedingly, because of the recent developments today. And open mobilization is not very likely, except this is what I wrote when I was preparing this, and now this is happening. Potential annexation of the occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, and these others, which then, of course, once you occupy them, automatically you can say that Ukrainian attacks on these are now attacks on Russia, and by nuclear doctrine, I can defend Russia with nukes. In Q&A, I can tell you why I think this is completely bonkers idea. It's not going to work, but they're going to try it, for sure. They've obviously decided to. The idea that Russia is going to transition with the declaration of war to a wartime economy, mobilize and produce stuff, is complete nonsense because their access, they just don't have anything. They simply cannot produce anything. They're 40, 50 years behind in technology in general. So without the Western inputs, they simply cannot produce stuff. And that's a very big problem for them. And I don't see how declaration of mobilization is going to resolve the officer shortage. Now they're sending people, they're graduating people from military schools early so they can become officers. These are not exactly, cadres with a lot of experience, as you might imagine, right? They're now mobilizing people from officers, the teachers from some of these schools. I mean, who's going to train the next generation? I don't know, but the level of desperation is just palpable there. And so I think even now the large-scale collapse of the Russian forces in Ukraine is just a matter of time at this point. All right. Unfortunately, I think peace is very unlikely. Why? Russia, especially Putin's team, cannot promise to abide by the terms that do not give it the territories it wants. Nobody's just going to believe it. Any peace terms must have the Russian army vacating the territories of Ukraine. Which Ukraine? When the war began, it was the February borders. Now the Ukrainians are saying it's the 1991 borders. That's it. And because if they stay there, they can always resume the offensive. And that's a problem. They're going to use a year or two to recover, and they're going to be back. They will always be back. This regime, just not going to give up. Putin personally, he's lied now so many times, nobody actually trusts him, right? So this means he will have to go. I think a coup against him is very unlikely, although now that he's decided to drag the country down with him, maybe it become more likely, or maybe tomorrow we wake up and he's sick and he needs rest and retires to look after his dog, I don't know. Basically, they're going to remove him in a peaceful, kind of more peaceful way without killing him. That has to happen. Otherwise, I don't see how. The Ukrainian government cannot promise to stop either. The Ukrainians, if you look at the recent surveys, they asked them point blank, are you ready to trade some territory for peace? 94%, no, we will fight. If Zelensky were to sign a peace instrument tomorrow that cedes Ukrainian territory, they'll string him up by the first lamppost. They're not going to care who he is. It's just not happening. So they cannot actually commit to making this work either at this point. And we cannot trust the Kremlin either. For 30 years, we bent over backward to ignore everything they did. Russia has been at war since 1991 in every single year of its existence, without exception. Wars it started in the regions, everywhere. We ignored them. We ignored Crimea, some sanctions. We just bought stuff from them, let the Europeans become dependent on them. And even then they attacked. I mean, what more do you want? Like, what else could we have done to live in peace? Many people asking this question now, and the Russians know that we're asking this question. So they know we cannot promise not to keep the sanctions and drive the regime basically into extinction at this point. So what comes next? So here, this is what I had from a few days ago. Ukrainian perspective, the best case scenario, the counteroffensive could turn out to be a turning point in this war, right? The Russian morale is going to collapse, the mobilization is going to fail, and the Kremlin is going to collapse into factional infighting. There's going to be a transitional regime of some sort, and they're going to try to extricate themselves. Everything's great. From the Russian perspective, I said the likely scenario, they're going to find some scapegoats. They're going to blame for the failures, right? Military advisor strategy doesn't matter. Then they're going to annex the territories, there you go, which they apparently started the process for today. They're going to mobilize for full war, supposedly, and they hope that the Western Union collapses in the face of a threat of a large world war, potentially involving nuclear weapons. And this seems to be, this is one of my two kind of scenarios, seems this is where Putin now has decided to go, at least judging by the events of today. What I think is actually likely is that all of this bluster is not going to go to nuclear strikes, and I can explain why. The war will revert to one of attrition, contest of will, and is going to, like, if it's just a military phase, it can last for months. It can last for a year. Politically, it can end tomorrow if it changes in the Kremlin. So it's impossible to predict, I think, how long this thing is going to last. But we are essentially not banking, judging by the stance of the administration, what the Ukrainians said, what Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief, said in a recent article he published. They think the war will go into the next year. And they think what needs to happen is to hurt the Russian sense of impunity, because they're attacking the entire Ukrainian territory, but the Ukrainians are not shooting back. Right? They're not attacking Russia. We have restrained them. The Ukrainians have restrained them because they're afraid of what Putin might do. But if he now declares this mobilization, there's no longer need to essentially restrain yourself. So it's very likely you'll see, especially attacks on the military infrastructure, on the supply side, in the border regions of Russia, I think. And this is going to bring the war closer to the Russians. So I think that's what's happening now, is the desperate kind of annexation gamble. This is the situation as of the other day on the front. The Ukrainians actually have broken through into Luhansk now, so that's part of the reason why the Russians are so panicked, is because now they're recovering a territory that the Russians kind of committed when they recognized its independence. So they have to do something about this. So now what happened today, the occupation authorities and the nominal heads of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye even, and Kherson, they've all announced they're going to have referenda for joining Russia. Well, these guys actually have to declare independence first and then join. They don't do it in the same referendum. I can predict right now between 85 and 90% support for the referendum here, and 70 to 80. How do I know this? I grew up in a communist country, so I know how this voting works. Here they said, in Kherson, they said they're going to go door to door for the convenience of the voters to record the votes. So, what's the significance? And this is what I'm going to conclude with. First of all, the Ukrainian nation. You can go in history, argue when the Ukrainian nation emerged, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, the new nation that's formed in front of the very eyes is new. It's absolutely new. There was a struggle of what Ukrainian meant, and there were kind of tensions in society. Is this a linguistic identity? Is it an ethnic? Is it a cultural? Blah, blah, blah. None of this now is going to be the case. You'll be a Ukrainian if you picked up arms to defend the country. This is going to make you Ukrainian. So if you want an analog, it's Israel after the War of Independence. So this means the military is going to remain strong in Ukraine. It's going to remain a cohesive kind of glue in society. It's going to be very prestigious to have served there. And they do need to have a strong military. I think after the end of the war, Ukraine will have probably the strongest land army in Europe, and the only battle-tested one. And the center of gravity for our security is probably going to shift toward the Baltics, Poland, and Ukraine, rather than Germany and France. Integration with the EU, for sure. NATO, I actually think probably true, because there's just no way, other ways to guarantee their security. They will have extremely bad economic problems. They already have them. They're running a deficit of $7 billion a month right now, right? So we need to help them tide over. There's massive humanitarian losses. The recovery is going to be very costly. And then there is some risk of them not transitioning into a democracy after all of this. And the reason I'm saying this, I saw a survey recently where they asked the Ukrainians, which institutions in society do you trust most? And it separated into 3 groups. And on the top, not surprisingly, the military, all of it. Military volunteers, like 85, 90% support. It's through the roof. In this first group, the lowest ranking thing was the office of the president with 71% or so. That's it. The next group, dramatic drop-off, 30% or less. So huge gap. These are your local institutions, humanitarian organizations, the police. And the very last group was negative rankings, actually. There's basically no trust in them. Government offices fighting corruption, government bureaucrats, political parties, parliament, and courts. And you're looking at this like some of these you will need to run a democracy and rule of law. But you understand where this comes from. They were thoroughly corrupt, right? So the Ukrainians instinctively just know not to trust them. Rebuilding this will be difficult. Zelensky will have to do a great job of not being seduced by the fact that the office of the president has such high prestige right now. I don't see anything in his character to suggest that he will become a tyrant or anything like this. But he needs to manage this transition to create this kind of society for Ukraine to emerge as a democracy. For Russia, it's a disaster at this point, regardless of when the war ends, frankly, or even how the war ends. The economy is going to be back 30, 40 years, in some places 50 years, like literally so. They're now producing cars, or a car, with technology that's from the 80s, from the Soviets. I mean, there's nothing. They cannot produce, even for the cars, ABS system. They cannot have automatic windows. I mean, there's nothing. No airbags, nothing. They'd be an international pariah, especially if they do what they seem to be planning to do. That's going to be a dramatic break with everything. There's going to be massive unemployment and social unrest, right? Social problems. This is a situation in which elites, local elites, may seize the initiative, and God knows what happens next. I think Putin is not going to survive this. One way or the other, he's going to go. But I also think his regime might fall, right? Right now, he's sided, it seems to me, with the extreme imperialist wing, which, they have their adherents, obviously, in the military. So the question is whether the people who want to extricate Russia from this without going down with the regime are going to be able to prevail. And I do not know the answer to this. At any rate, I think democracy in Russia is not in the cards anytime soon, which means falling of sanctions is not very likely. We'll release some of them, but most of them will stay in place, which means the country is going to remain basically isolated for a very long time. There's a possible secession movement. I actually think, it's putting my tinfoil hat on for a little bit, Chechnya might actually go first. That's because Kadyrov is in position, it entirely depends on Putin. He's extremely loyal to Putin. But what happens if Putin goes? Now, he has 40,000 troops under his command who are only answerable to him, nobody else, essentially. So either he joins with somebody in Russia to get this group to prevail in an internal conflict, or he suddenly decides, I actually was pretending all the time and I'm a Chechen nationalist, let's go. Who's going to stop him? And the answer is probably nothing, except other Chechens maybe. So he recently took to installing anti-aircraft system in Chechnya, and you all wondered, like, who's going to be attacking him with airplanes there? They're not the Ukrainians. So again, and if this happens, the dominoes might fall. There's a lot, actually, of regions that may go if this happens. And of course, this big collapse of influence in Asia. I wrote this before the meeting in Samarkand recently, and this made it very clear in Samarkand. Everybody made Putin wait. The Indian leader, the Prime Minister Modi, told him point blank, this is not a time to fight war. Putin's like, oh yeah, I know, you've told me many times. Yeah. So basically China and India apparently told him the war has to end now, like ASAP. The problem is the way he's chosen to end it, with this massive escalation. He cannot wait, so he cannot continue this attritional strategy anymore. And so for us, the significance, first of all, stress test of the European Union, and it has both good and bad signs here. Good signs, we rallied, I'm sorry, that's my Bulgarian hat on. The European Union rallied, but there's also a rise still of nationalist sentiments that closely tied to Putin. Italy is going to have a new prime minister who's basically a fascist. The Swedes elected a government that is drastically in that direction as well. Hungary is, well, the European Parliament just declared that it's no longer democracy, and it's refusing to give them funds. So there's also these things. So on the balance, it's good, I think, but it's not all roses, right? The good thing about it, the European Union is going to wean off its dependence on Russian energy sources, and that's now a given. They lost this leverage, and the governments that follow in Moscow after Putin are going to deeply regret this part, because it's going to curtail their influence quite a bit. Germans will probably rearm to some extent, unlike some of my colleagues who think this is going to, World War III Germany is going to rise again. No, I don't think so. NATO, of course, got expanded and revitalized without direct conflict with Russia, at least for now, which is great for us. Recent surveys in the US, just a few days ago, support for NATO is at ever since they started taking the survey in 1974, it's never been higher than right now. So Americans have basically committed to NATO again. And more interestingly, the Americans have committed, or the American public, I mean, support for Finland and Sweden joining NATO is over 85%, is very high. Surprisingly, support for Ukraine is over 70%. And the question was worded, do you support Ukraine joining NATO, even if this means we will have to fight to defend against another Russian aggression? 71, I think, percent said, yeah, we will do it. So this is dramatic changes here. I mean, that's one thing I guess most Americans now can agree with. We desperately need something to agree on. That seems to be it, which is good. We found out that we actually have still a lot of friends around the world and a lot of influence left. And that is great. That is great for China. If it's contemplating similar scenarios for Taiwan, this is now going to create a problem. The US is not, or the West is this isolated as these illiberal forces have been claiming for many, many years. Again, there's going to be a cascade of falling of Russian influence abroad. Basically, the entire Asia is going to now rearrange. It's already started. Kazakhstan's moving closer to China, obviously. Armenia and Azerbaijan are now fighting against over Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey is there in the mix. It's a complicated story. Be happy to take it up at the Q&A if you want to know. We will have to be involved, not for nothing. Pelosi was in Armenia recently in Yerevan to kind of say, well, Armenia, everybody abandoned you. I guess we're it. You want to do something. And Armenia is surrounded from all sides for people that want to destroy it, right? You have Azerbaijan, you have Iran, you have Turkey, and you have Russia. So you don't actually have many friends now that threw them to the wolves. There must have been a deal that they concocted with Erdogan. Anyway. And so I think for us, it's a problem that people imagine to use Russia as a counter to China, the way we used China as a counter to Russia in the Cold War. That's not going to happen. There's no chance of this anymore. So that means we're kind of on our own in that sense in Asia. And hopefully it's going to be a wake-up call in the West to resist the democratic backsliding that's been happening there all along. So with this, I'm going to end. It's probably run a lot longer than I anticipated. I have lots of posts here on this that tracks the war and uses political science theories to try to explain things. So I'll stop here.